talk about parties. What I consider to be both the best feature that a video game can have, and in some cases, the worst feature that a video game can have. Let's talk about the good things, the bad things, and maybe it'll help you decide if you want to have a party in your game. We'll be pretty broad here. I'm going to define party as any time when you have at least one additional NPC along with you when you're out in the world. So if you have NPCs back at base that you talk to, that's not a party. But as soon as there's at least one other person, even if it's your son, like in the new God of Wars, that's going to qualify as a party. The number of people in that party makes a big difference, but as soon as you go from 0 to 1, we're going to call that a party. We're also going to start with the assumption that you have a character. So an RTS where you control a whole bunch of different characters all at once, and there isn't really a you, we're not going to call that a party either. That's a different thing where the game is built around this group control. As we talk through it, we're going to break it into 3 primary categories: narrative, exploration, and gameplay. In gameplay, we'll talk about combat, but we'll also talk about some other aspects of the party that can be interesting, but also can be extra confusing. As we talk about each of these different benefits or dangers of parties, I'm going to talk about ways to mitigate the problem if you want to have a party. And I'll give you some tips or potential tricks to gain a benefit if you don't want to have a party. So narrative is, I would say, the primary reason that you may be thinking about having a party. You may be thinking, oh, it'd be really nice to have some other people along for the ride so that we can tell a different, better, deeper story. And that's one of the primary benefits of having a party. It gives you someone to talk to. It means that when you see something or interact with something, you're able to have dialogue going on without having the PC talking to themselves. As we move from a single person in your party up to 2 or 3, you actually get additional benefits because now you have characters who can talk to each other and have different interactions while you're out in the world. If you want someone to talk to in your game, but you don't want to have a party, then give them someone to talk to in some other way. So the classic superhero solution is the guy in the chair. This is how television solved the solo superhero problem, is by having someone on the radio talking to the PC, talking to the superhero over the radio so that these conversations can happen even when the superhero is by themselves. And it doesn't make sense for there to be other people along because they're superpowered and nobody else is superpowered on their side. So it gives them someone else to talk to. Similarly, in a fantasy game, you can introduce a talking sword or a talking hat that they can interact with so that there can be this interaction without there being another person in the space. If you have a party, there can be times when you specifically don't want the player character to have someone to talk to. But this, rather than being a problem, is actually an opportunity because you can gain an immense amount of emotional impact by taking their party away. Whether they be kidnapped, whether the player character falls through a hole in the ground and is cut off from their support structure. That, if you have a party, can actually give you an opportunity. It actually adds more tools to your toolbox. One possible downside to a large party with a large bench of potential party members is it introduces a lot of potential cross channels. So if you have a party that consists of, say, 3 NPCs, and you are picking from 12 or 13 different potential NPCs, the number of ways those 3 NPCs that are in your party can interact with each other is very large. And if you want that interaction to exist, you potentially have to write a lot of dialogue. And on any one playthrough, a player is going to see a tiny fraction of that dialogue. Now, if you do it, that can add an immense amount of depth to your world, to your storytelling, because what you now have is you have the robot guy interacting with the plant guy, and that's an interesting conversation. Whereas if I took the ex-soldier and the pacifist, I get a different conversation. So if you're willing to put the work in, those multiple paths of interaction can actually enrich your storytelling quite a bit. And it gives a different vector for people to re-engage with your story, to replay the story. But it is worth taking into account is having one person in my party gives me someone to talk to. Having two people in my party allows them to talk to each other in addition to giving me someone to talk to. But we get diminishing returns once we move past two. And once we move to a large party or a large bench, the combinatorial explosion of different interactions can become fairly large. And it is worth keeping in mind as you consider adding an additional follower to your bench or increasing your party size from 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 or even up to 5 or 6 or beyond that. Beyond a certain point, it becomes necessary to thin out these interactions to the point where you're not getting as much benefit as you otherwise would, because the burden of those interactions becomes so large that from a pure cost-saving perspective, you have to prioritize volume over depth. In addition to being someone to talk to, these other party members know stuff. If you want to have your PC be a blank slate, a tabula rasa, it can be very useful to have someone in the party that can explain things both to the PC, but also to the player. It gives another perspective that allows this information to come into the player's sphere for them to get this information without you having to just dump a bunch of exposition on them at any one moment. It gives someone that can comment on things that are going on. On the flip side of that, you can actually accomplish the same thing if you don't have a blank slate protagonist by making one of the party members essentially be a blank slate. So if there is a disconnect between player knowledge and PC knowledge, what you can do is introduce a party member who has a similar knowledge level to the player. And then you can have the PC be the one doing the explaining. By having this difference in knowledge, it gives you the opportunity to introduce exposition in other more natural ways. Now, sometimes it can become a problem because you want the PC to not know what's going on, and you're going to one of your party members' hometowns, and it doesn't make sense that they wouldn't know where the bakery is. It's something you have to keep in mind, but it is relatively easy to write around this. Either you just take that potential party member away temporarily, or you simply lose the ability to have that degree of confusion in certain circumstances where party members would naturally, logically be able to fill in around the gaps. Not the biggest negative in the world. If you're looking to explore a wider degree of topics and perspectives, having multiple party members around who come from different backgrounds, who come from different places, allows you to have this conversation out in the world as you encounter things. So you are able to have the pragmatist and the optimist argue with each other as the player is having to make a decision between these two different choices. Ideally, if you want players to engage in different philosophies, you want them to do that through characters as opposed to causes. Having an organization out in the world can be very difficult for a player to really get their minds around, really engage in what you're asking them to do. But if they are already interacting with a person, even an artificial person, then that interaction allows them to get a grip on this philosophy to a much deeper degree than if it's largely a faceless organization. Now, if you don't have a party, you can get this same benefit by having them interact with a small number of characters that represent those philosophies and build a relationship with those characters. The benefit you get from a party is you have them with you in every single possible moment. In the moment when something happens, they're there to say something. Whereas if you don't have a party, to do it with a character potentially distances the moment of question with the discussion of answer. This is a place where a large bench can change things significantly, because if you have 12 possible followers, but only 3 are allowed in the party at any one time, then you're not guaranteed to have the right people along. you might end up having only the pacifists along in the moment when you want to have that philosophical discussion between the pacifists and the more aggressive characters. And this can be awesome. This can be an awesome moment, an awesome differentiation of the experience that different players have if you're willing to lean into it. But now we get back into that combinatorial explosion because you have a lot of potential interactions in order to give that reactivity. If you don't take that into account, what you can think is that you're adding all this reactivity, all this deep philosophical discussion throughout your game, but many players are only going to see a small fraction of it because they don't bring along the followers who have something to say about the things you want them to say something about. If you push this even further, if you take their perspectives even further, there are lines that party members logically won't cross. They have beliefs that they won't betray. This can give you an interesting moment where there is a tension between a party member and the player character that can escalate into something much larger. You can do this in other ways. You can have the pacifist show up in the world and try to stop you from killing that character. But again, because you have the party member in your party and they're around for the moment that occurs, it allows you to take advantage of more opportunities without having to come up with a reason why this other non-party member is around in that moment. But this can also be a problem because you might have a really interesting potential party member that you want to have, but there is something in your story where it doesn't make sense that they would continue to stay with the player character beyond this point. You are forced to burn down their hometown. And the way that you have written this character, it doesn't make sense that they would continue to travel with the player character beyond this point. This can be an opportunity if you're willing to pull on that thread and investigate and to write around that line. But often what can happen is that you write the character, you write the story, and then in the later stages, you realize that, oh, wait, we've ended up in a situation where this party member should have a line right here, and we can't really retrofit it. In that case, honestly, the answer might just be that you kind of eat it and hope that the player's suspension of disbelief allows them to accept that. You may be able to band-aid it to some degree with some reactivity to the player's actions. But yeah, there are times when you're going to find yourself in a situation where it doesn't really make sense that this party member didn't turn on you or at least leave because of the actions that the player is taking. One of the really big advantages of party members as opposed to other NPCs is that they're around. So that means you're interacting with them all of the time. So they have things to say, even if it's small stuff. You are forming a relationship much more deeply with a party member, as opposed to if your potential love interest is sitting back at camp. You can certainly have romances and relationships without a party, but you need to provide opportunities to interact with those NPCs in such a way that that relationship can form. You're getting a lot of interaction basically for free by having them come along with you into the world. Now, you do need to write them reacting to different things in the world. You need to have them interact with the player a lot of times out in the world for it to really work. But even if you don't do that, even if your party is completely silent once you leave your camp and they only really have things to say in camp, you are still going to get a deeper connection to those party members simply for them being along for the ride. If you are telling a story, then you need to motivate the characters in that story. When you have party members, you need to motivate their reason for joining your party. Why are they leaving the situation they were in order to join up with you? Why are they not doing some other action that might seem more logical? It's something that you need to take into account as you are designing a party. If you rescue someone from a jail cell and they join with you while you're in the prison, that makes perfect sense. But once you get out of the prison, why are they staying with you beyond that point? Now, these can just serve as hooks when you are writing these characters. Maybe they are connected to the events that the player character is trying to stop. Maybe they have a connection to the player character directly. Maybe there's some reason that they don't want to be with you, but they have no choice. These are just things to keep in mind as you're writing your characters, as you're writing your potential party members, so that there's enough reason for them to stay, that it isn't something that the player is thinking about all the time. It doesn't need to be a ton. It just needs to be plausible that they're sticking around. One of the big narrative negatives, really arguably kind of the only one that isn't just a thing you have to kind of write yourself around, is that having a party can cause a certain degree of distancing of the player from their player character. Partially, this can be mitigated through controls, because in something like Dragon Age Inquisition, you can end up in control of someone other than your player character. And for some players, that can be discordant, and it causes a breaking of their connection to their own player character. So if you have a game with a party, but there's only single control, you can only control Kratos, you don't control Kratos' son, it can help anchor the player to the player character more fully. But even still, as you have a larger and larger party, even with forced single control, it can cause the player to kind of rise away from the player character and almost sit above the entire situation, which can be desirable in certain kinds of storytelling, but usually isn't what you want. Usually you want them really inside that player character, really feeling what that player character is feeling as they move through the story. If narrative is the number one reason to have a party, I would say exploration is the number one reason to not have a party. There are some advantages. By having a party, you can have a wider swath of exploration powers. You can have a party member that is entirely made of mist, which lets you get through keyholes. You can have party members that are able to enter into secure locations because they are members of the military, or they have the pass or whatever that allows them to get places with the player character that otherwise doesn't make any sense. You can certainly work around this. You can make the player character be able to do everything that you would otherwise be able to do. I mean, that's basically what a Metroid is. A omni-purpose Swiss Army knife style player character who, over the course of the game, gathers more and more exploration powers. If you need another character to help you be able to do something, you can temporarily have someone come along to unlock the door or to get through the keyhole. So there are ways to work around this, but this does give you a much bigger toolbox when it comes to what you can do in exploration. That isn't always a good thing, because you can find yourself in a situation where some of the potential party members, it makes perfect sense for them to have certain exploration powers, and some it does not, and it can become off-putting for the potential players if they feel like they have to take the water-bending follower because they're going to need them to get past that lake, whereas the person who's really good at flower arranging has no useful exploration power. This can be a benefit, but as you have a larger bench of potential party members, it can become a shackle that puts you into a design space that you may not really want to be in. Similarly, just having a party allows you to do two things at once. It allows you to have two pressure plates where a party member stands on one and you stand on the other, and then the doors open. I don't know that this is really a positive or a negative. If you don't want to have a party, just cut those things. It's not really a huge design space. It is a thing you get to do if you have a party where you can control other members of the party in some manner. Okay, the biggest problem with a party is pathfinding. There's now at least one other person who isn't directly controlled by you having to move through the space. And they're going to get in the way, and they're going to get in the way a lot. And this is really an exponentially worse problem as your party gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Because with only a single party member, they're only getting in your way. As you move to two, they're getting in each other's ways. If you have 5 other party members other than the player, they're going to be in each other's way all of the time. There are ways to work around this. If you want a party for narrative reasons, you may be able to have a party in a pocket where while you are moving, they disappear and they're out of the way. And only when you're in a situation when that interaction would be beneficial do they come out and then they stand around in the space. Or what you see in older RPGs is the conga line party. So you have 4 people and they go tunk, 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 and they just follow along exactly on the path you were on. And if you turn around and walk backwards, you just pass directly through them. Even if you don't do a conga line style party, allowing the player to pass through followers with some rules is probably a solution you are going to want to have, because if you don't do this, there is an inevitable fail case where they are going to lock the player in a room and the game is going to basically be broken at that point. Creepy Watson is simply allowing the followers, allowing the other party members to teleport around when they're not visible to the player. This is a very good trick that some developers don't like using, but most players won't notice that their followers are teleporting around if they're not seeing them disappear and reappear. If they're only doing this when they're off screen, the suspension of disbelief from the most players is going to be sufficient for them to expect that they somehow got to where they were supposed to be. And this is not to say Creepy Watson should be your first solution to keeping the party together, to keeping people where they're supposed to be, but a good last solution. It's a good fallback to have that allows the party to stay together no matter what happens, and most of the time you're going to get away with it. Now, it's called Creepy Watson because there was a Sherlock Holmes game which had very poor pathfinding for the Watson character, and he was constantly teleporting directly behind Sherlock Holmes, so he was always creeping around behind there, hence Creepy Watson. This is the number one pitfall for a party, is that they are in the space and they take up space and they have to move through that space, and as a result, they are going to get in the way. Similarly, they just simply take up more space. This is going to affect the way you design levels. It's harder to have very claustrophobic, narrow spaces if you need there to be room for 5 people to stand around. Same solutions. You can have them party in the pocket during these spaces. You can do the conga line where you can pass through each other and just simply have them follow the path that the player follows. Another thing you can do in tighter quarters is have action stations. So when you go into the market, your party spreads out and goes to individually to each individual stall to essentially get out of the way while the PC can move through the space without a bunch of followers being in the way. But them taking up more space and pathfinding together form the major issue that is the reason why you don't see parties in all games. Because this is a hard problem that requires a significant amount of work to solve. And if you aren't really getting anything because of the way your narrative is designed, it's probably not worth it. If narrative is mostly positives and navigation and exploration is mostly negatives, gameplay is kind of a mixed bag. It's kind of your mileage may vary. It's going to really depend on what you're looking to do, what you're looking to design in terms of what your game is going to be. One thing that having party members lets you do is have these hyper specialized powers, these hyper specialized followers that can do things that would be useless in most cases. If you have a power that's very good against constructs but does nothing against non-constructs, probably not a power most players are going to take for their PC. But if you have a follower that comes with that power, then when you go up against those constructs, they suddenly become very useful. You can very easily get a lot of the same benefit by introducing equipment that provides the same benefit, that gives that power through the equipment itself, or allowing the player to respec their PC on the fly. But by having a party, it does allow for more specialization in these party members, and it allows you to help the player explore more of the design space without them having to fully understand the possibility of your ability system. Similarly, it can cover for the player. If the player character didn't take any healing powers, they can take along a follower who has a healing power. If you have a fixed party, this works really well because you know that you have the player character who could be anything, and then you have 2 or 3 other followers who are able to blend out and provide a broader swath of abilities and to kind of smooth out the experience. If, on the other hand, you have a bench, this can actually make things worse, because what can happen, as opposed to, I didn't take any healing powers, I'm going to take a follower with a healing power. I didn't take any healing powers, and I'm not going to take any followers that have healing powers. In fact, I'm going to take the most anti-healing followers I can possibly do it. So here, a benefit can turn into a failure, because if you give the player control over who's in their party and potentially over the abilities that those party members have, your edges can actually become even sharper. Your edge cases can become even worse, potentially, because I play a guy that only uses heavy weapons, and then I take along 3 people who also only take heavy weapons, and we have a party that does nearly infinite amounts of damage, but is incredibly slow moving and has no defensive capabilities. That potentially might make the entire game incredibly trivial, or arguably worse, it might be a stratagem that works 90% of the time, and 10% of the time is completely useless, and you have a player who has learned to play the game in a very specific way that isn't able to play it in any other way, and they hit that combat where the team of 4 heavy weapon specialists is going to be unable to beat it, and they just get stuck, and they just nope out of your game. You can mitigate this. You can require different party members for different missions just to, again, smooth things out. You can find these in your testing phases, and you can rebalance to handle them. But in a lot of cases, if your game is a single-player game, maybe you just eat it. If you're making a multiplayer game, yeah, you probably don't want these hyper-degenerative experiences, because you end up with a game where the balance is so off that people don't want to engage in your multiplayer. But in a single player, you can accept that your balance isn't going to be as perfect. And in some ways, it can actually be beneficial. It's less problematic to have a build or party makeup that breezes through every combat in a single player game than it is to have a party makeup where they are usually successful and occasionally get stuck, because it's difficult for players to change their habits if you aren't forcing them to do it along the way. So you should at least try to find these situations to nudge people away from things that are going to get them stuck. It's hard to say whether the requirements of controls are a positive or negative. It really depends on the kind of game you're making and the kind of game your player is expecting to have. If you're going to have a party of 6 people, and I can take direct control of each individual person in that party, you're putting a lot of cognitive load on the player in order to control that party. And like we talked about in narrative, that control can cause a distancing where they lose their connection to their PC and start to feel more like an omnipresent overlord that is controlling the group as opposed to being a single character in the story. You can make the party members simpler than the player characters, so controlling them is easier. You can do what Mass Effect does and have it so that I stay in control of my PC and I give orders to my party members, which keeps me anchored in the player character and simplifies their control. It again depends on what you're trying to make. It might be your desire to have this very tactical control of the party, in which case this is a positive, not a negative. Similarly to that, you also have to deal with the party management outside of combat. If you have an inventory, do the party members have an inventory? If you have a bench, do the bench members have an inventory? You could very easily go from having a single set of abilities and equipment to manage to having 10 sets of abilities and equipment to manage. And that can become a big problem, because what you will find is that some players will love that, will really want to engage in exactly how each of their party members is equipped and specced out and really engage in that system, while others will constantly forget to upgrade the armor on their tank and will only focus on their own personal equipment. And you end up in a situation where there's another point of failure in terms of player engagement. You can simplify the party members' inventories and abilities to make this easier. You should definitely consider some form of auto level up so that the party members can be allowed to at least kind of maintain pace with the player. But again, depending on the kind of game you're making, some people love this. Some people want this extra complexity. So think about the game that you are making, think about what your players are looking for before you decide this is a negative and simplify it away. If you have direct control of each party member, this problem doesn't really exist. But if you don't, if you are doing some form of control that is different than that, you are doing orders or they are only controlled by AI, then something you need to think about is kill stealing. It can really feel bad for a player if their party is constantly stealing their kills away from the player character. If all of the party members, including the player character, are on the same power level, which is how the first 3 Dragon Age games worked, then this is quite likely to happen because they're going to use abilities based upon their AI, and those abilities are as good as the player character's ability, but there are 3 of them and there's only 1 of you, so the chance of them kill stealing is actually very high. The way that Mass Effect got around this was by making the party members actually worse than the player character. They do less damage, they use their abilities less often unless directly ordered by the player. So what that does is it means they almost never kill steal unless you tell them to use an ability. If they use an ability because you told them, then that ability is at full power. And that doesn't feel like a kill steal because it feels like you told them to do it. If you have direct party control, this doesn't feel as bad because it feels like you're telling them what to do. But in the situations where you have AI-controlled followers, you do need to keep in mind that they will kill steal from the player character, and you need to think about whether or not that is something that you want to try to avoid. You can certainly put mitigations in place, but it's something to keep in mind. I think it's worth digging in a little bit more deeply on the bench. I've talked about how a really large bench gives you a lot more problems. So how do you decide how deep your bench needs to be? If you have a fixed party, then you don't need a bench because the party is exactly who you say it is. Kratos doesn't get to decide which of his sons he brings along. He has his son along, and that's just the way that it's going to be. If you are looking for the player to form a deeper, potentially even romantic relationship with one of the followers, then it's good to have options. It's good to have more followers than you need to fill a single party. Because if you don't have that, then the simple logistics of your maximum realistic party size, which is really around 3, 4, or 5, is going to limit how much relationship opportunity you're giving to the player. It also gives the player more choices for other things. If they want to bring along a heavy weapon specialist, it's a good idea to have 2 of them at least, because if they don't like one of them, if they don't like the personality of one of them, they have the option to take the other one. One of the frustrations that some players have with Dragon Age 2 is the followers are very limited in what they are able to do from an ability perspective. So Fenris is the only 2-handed warrior that is available and is significantly different gameplay-wise from the other warrior, who is a sword and shield warrior. And because of that, if you feel like you need a strong damage-dealing warrior, your only choice is Fenris. But if Fenris is someone whose personality and story and character you don't like, then you're kind of feeling stuck, and that is grating. If you allow me to respec or change the followers to a significant degree, you can mitigate this issue, because then I could take Fenris and turn him into a sword and shield warrior, or vice versa, and make the characters play the way I want. And then be able to more customize the party ahead along to not have gameplay in conflict with storytelling. But that also introduces the complexity of that management, which you may have decided to try to avoid by simplifying down and restricting the amount that the followers could be modified. Typically, you're going to want to give the player at least 2 options for everything that you want them to be making a choice about. If you have romances, you want at least 2 potential party members that they could romance based upon their potential preferences. If the party members fall into different classes, you want to provide ideally 2 of each of those classes. Once you get to 2, then at least you're able to let the players choose from a collection of different options. But you do potentially run into the risk of having the player wanting some attributes of one of the choices and not others, so it can still get you into that same problem. As you get a larger and larger bench, a lot of the benefits you have from specialization or normalization or having the party members know things about other things become very dependent on the player choosing the right party members in the right moments. So you may find that giving too much choice, having too large of a party, results in you losing a lot of the advantages that you gain by having a party, because you never are able to know who's along at any moment. And as a result, you're never able to put in that reactivity. You're never able to rely on the fact that they have a healer along. You're never able to be sure that they haven't hyper specialized their party into some sort of monstrosity that is impossible to balance against. So you want there to be boundaries on the size of your bench. Or if you want that bench to be as large as possible, you may find it useful to force the player into picking some characters at some times. Probably not all the time, probably not all the characters, but if you're going on a mage-focused mission, maybe they have to take along a mage follower. So then at least you know that one of the party members is a mage in the missions where it would be useful to have that reactivity from a mage talking about what's going on. If you're going into the back alleys of Paris, maybe you have to take along a party member who is French so that they have something to say about what's happening in the environment. And you can narratively justify that fairly easily. You don't want to lock everything in place because then it feels like you don't have a bench at all, but you can get away with locking in one character quite often or potentially all the characters occasionally in order to gain some of those benefits that a very large bench would otherwise make very difficult. So should you have a party? It really depends on the kind of game that you're making. There are some really big costs to having a party around exploration, around the cognitive load that you are adding to the player character. But it also increases your tactical space immensely. That complexity can be a desirable side effect. And it really puts a ton of tools on the table in terms of how you tell your story. So ultimately, it's going to really depend on you and the kind of game that you're making and the kind of game that your players are looking for. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you're interested in supporting the channel in that way. Both channel members and Patreons get access to our Discord. So if you're looking for a deeper way to interact with this community, that's a great way to do it. What did I forget? I'm sure there are things that I missed from this list. What are some benefits or pitfalls that you've seen in parties, in games that you've played, or games that you've worked on? Let's talk about that down in the comments. I will see you again soon. Thank you.